All right, buckle up for a deep dive, folks. We're diving into some pretty choppy waters today. We're talking about this group of climate scientists who sent out a pretty dire open letter.
Oh,
Yeah, warning about a potential collapse of a major ocean current system. The AMOC, the one that keeps Europe warm?
right.
That one. And the Arctic is what's ground zero for this potential climate catastrophe.
Yeah, it's like the Arctic's holding its breath, just waiting to see if this crucial system will hold or not.
Exactly. So first things first, what exactly is the AMOC?
Well, think of it kind of like a giant underwater conveyor belt. In the Atlantic Ocean, it carries warm water from the tropics up north where it cools, gets denser and sinks, then flows back down south, at depth. This massive circulation system, it's like the heart of the North Atlantic, pumping warmth, regulating temperatures across the globe. And it's a major reason why Europe has a relatively mild climate, even though it's at a high latitude.
Okay, so it's a pretty big deal for the planet's climate. So who are these scientists sending out this SOS? And why do they choose an open letter to get their message across?
Well, these are climate scientists actively working in the field, and they specifically address their letter to the Nordic Council of Ministers. So this choice of audience, it's not random. The Nordic countries are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of an AMC collapse, so the scientists wanted to get their attention directly.
Makes sense. They're basically saying, hey, this is on your doorstep, folks.
Yeah.
And I got to say, the language they use is pretty intense.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of urgency and gravity in their words. They talk about devastating and irreversible impacts. They're warning of, catastrophic events and unprecedented extreme weather. They're not sugarcoating the potential consequences.
No, they're not. They're dropping some serious truth bombs. And the key idea that they emphasize is this concept of tipping points. Sounds kind of ominous, to be honest.
Yeah, it is a bit. Because tipping points are these critical thresholds in the climate system. Think of it like an ice cube melting. Once it starts, it melts faster and faster. Tipping points are similar. Once we cross them, things can change rapidly and irreversibly. And these scientists are warning that the Arctic, it's teetering on the edge of several interconnected tipping points.
So the Arctic is like a giant ice cube that's starting to melt way too fast. What exactly are these tipping points they're talking about?
Well, they specifically mention the Greenland ice sheet melting, the Barents Sea ice disappearing, the thawing of permafrost, and, of course, the potential collapse of the AMOC. They're all linked. Changes in one can trigger changes in the others, creating a domino effect with major consequences.
So what they're saying is that messing with one part of this delicate Arctic system could send the whole thing crashing down.
That's right. And what's really worrying is that recent research suggests the risk of an AMOC collapse. Well, it might be even higher than previously thought. You see, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assessed the likelihood of an AMOC collapse before 2100 with medium confidence.
Medium confidence? That doesn't sound all that reassuring.
You're right, it's not. But here's where it gets really interesting. The scientists behind this open letter point to new research, published after that IPCC report. And this newer research suggests that the AMOC could potentially collapse much sooner, perhaps even within the next few decades.
Wait, so we're not talking about some distant future problem here?
Exactly. Even if the full collapse takes centuries to unfold, the point is that it could be triggered this century. And that's a game changer.
Wow, okay. This is getting pretty intense. So let's say this worst-case scenario actually happens and the AMOC collapses. What kind of impacts are we talking about here? Paint me a picture.
Well, the open letter paints a pretty stark picture, especially for the Nordic countries. First, they could experience major cooling, even as other parts of the world continue to warm. Think of it like that cold blob phenomenon we've already observed in the North Atlantic, but even more pronounced and widespread. On top of that, they could also be hit with unprecedented extreme weather events.
So Nordic winters could become even more brutal with crazy weather events thrown into the mix. That doesn't sound like a very cozy future. What about the rest of the world? Would we escape unscathed?
Unfortunately, no. An AME collapse, it wouldn't be contained to the Nordic region. It would have global consequences, impacting everything from rainfall patterns to sea level rise.
Okay, so this isn't just a regional problem, it's a global one.
Precisely. And that's a key point these scientists are trying to drive home with their open letter. They're highlighting a specific regional risk. But it's ultimately a call to action for the entire world.
So what exactly are they urging the world to do?
Well, within their letter, they have two main requests for the Nordic Council of Ministers. First, they want them to conduct a thorough assessment of the risks their region faces. specifically from an AMOC collapse. Second, they're calling for action to minimize this risk. And this is where it connects to the bigger picture of climate change mitigation. They're basically saying we need urgent global action to slash greenhouse gas emissions and get as close as possible to that 1.5 degrees Celsius target set by the Paris Agreement.
Right, the Paris Agreement, that global agreement to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5. So in a way, this open letter about a specific regional risk is also a call for global solidarity on climate change.
Absolutely. It underscores the fact that we're all in this together, and what happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects across the planet.
This is a lot to take in. We've gone from a group of scientists writing a letter to talking about a potential global climate catastrophe.
It is a lot to process, and it underscores the urgency of the situation. We can't afford to ignore these warnings from scientists who are studying these complex systems. We need to listen, learn, and act accordingly.
So what you're saying is that even though this open letter focuses on the Nordic countries, the message resonates far beyond their borders. We all have a stake in this.
Exactly. This is a wake-up call for the entire world, and it's a reminder that the choices we make today will determine the future of our planet.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. So we've established that the AMOC is vitally important for the planet's climate, and its potential collapse could have catastrophic consequences. But what exactly would those consequences look like? Let's break it down and get into the nitty-gritty details.
Let's start with those potential impacts on the Nordic countries, since that's the focus of the open letter. As I mentioned, they could experience a significant drop in temperature. Imagine a scenario where the cold blob phenomenon, that patch of unusually cold water in the North Atlantic, well, imagine it expands and intensifies. That's what an AMOC collapse could bring.
Brr. Not exactly the kind of climate change most people think of. So we're talking about potentially much harsher winters and maybe even shorter growing seasons. What else could they expect?
Well, beyond the temperature drop, they could also face unprecedented extreme weather events. Think about more intense storms, heavier precipitation, perhaps even more frequent droughts in some areas. The thing is, the exact impacts are difficult to predict with certainty, but the overall picture is one of increased instability and disruption.
Wow, so the Nordic countries could be hit with a double whammy. Colder temperatures and more extreme weather, that sounds pretty rough.
It does, and the scientists behind this open letter are particularly concerned about the potential consequences for agriculture. In northwestern Europe, a colder climate with more erratic weather patterns, well, it could significantly reduce crop yields, leading to food shortages and economic instability.
Okay, so we're talking about impacts that go far beyond just an uncomfortable chill in the air. This could disrupt entire industries and livelihoods.
Exactly. And remember, these are just the potential impacts on the Nordic region. The consequences of an AMOC collapse, they would be felt around the world.
Right, we talked about that earlier. Can you remind us what some of those global impacts might be?
Well, one major concern is shifts in the tropical rainfall belts. These belts are crucial for agriculture in many heavily populated regions, and any disruption could have devastating consequences for food security and water resources.
So we're talking about potential droughts and famines in some of the most vulnerable parts of the world.
That's a real possibility. And then there's the issue of the ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide. Right now, the oceans act kind of like a giant sponge, soaking up a significant portion of the CO2 we release into the atmosphere. But an AMC collapse, well, it could reduce this uptake, leading to a faster buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and, further accelerating global warming.
It's like a vicious cycle. The AM2 collapse could actually worsen climate change on a global scale.
Precisely. And as if that weren't enough, we could also see additional sea level rise, especially along the American Atlantic coast, and major disruptions to marine ecosystems and fisheries, worldwide.
This is painting a pretty bleak picture. So what are the scientists suggesting we do about all this? Is there any way to prevent this potential catastrophe?
Well, the scientists in the open letter emphasize a crucial point. Adapting to a full-blown AMOC collapse simply isn't a viable option. The impacts would be too profound and widespread.
So building higher seawalls or developing drought-resistant crops wouldn't cut it.
It would be like trying to build a wall high enough to hold back the entire Atlantic Ocean. Simply not feasible. The scale of the challenge would be immense.
Okay, so adaptation is off the table. What about mitigation? Can we do anything to prevent the AMOC from collapsing in the first place?
That's where the focus needs to be. The scientists are urging swift and decisive action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The goal is to slow down global warming and keep temperatures as close as possible to that 1.5 degrees Celsius target set by the Paris Agreement. That's our best bet for preventing the worst-case scenarios, including an AMC collapse.
It sounds like a daunting challenge, but also a necessary one. But this open letter is specifically addressed to the Nordic Council of Ministers. What role do they play in this global effort?
Well, while global action is essential, regional efforts are equally important. And the Nordic countries are in a unique position to demonstrate leadership on climate action.
You mentioned earlier that they have a history of environmental stewardship. What specifically could they do to address the risks posed by an AMG collapse?
They could take concrete steps to transition away from fossil fuels and embrace renewable energy sources. Imagine if they went all in on wind, solar, geothermal energy, and other sustainable solutions. They could also implement policies to boost energy efficiency and reduce consumption across all sectors.
So it's about leading by example, showing the world that it's possible to build a prosperous and sustainable future without relying on fossil fuels.
Exactly. And they could go even further by investing heavily in research and development of new climate technologies. Think about innovations in carbon capture and storage, or breakthroughs in battery technology that would make renewable energy even more efficient and reliable.
It sounds like they have the potential to be real pioneers in this field,
Yeah.
paving the way for other countries to follow suit.
They do, and that's why this open letter is so significant. It's not just a warning, it's a call to action for the Nordic countries to step up and be leaders in the global fight against climate change.
It's inspiring to think that even in the face of these potential climate catastrophes, there's still hope, and there's still concrete steps we can take to make difference.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, it's also a bit overwhelming to think about the scale of the challenge ahead.
It is a monumental task, but it's not insurmountable. We have the knowledge, the technology, and the resources to address climate change. What we need now is the political will and the collective determination to act. And that starts with understanding the interconnectedness of these issues, realizing that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic.
Right, like we've been discussing this whole time, the potential collapse of the AMOC, while posing specific risks to the Nordic region, ultimately has implications for the entire planet.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial point the scientists make in their letter: the need for increased international cooperation and collaboration.
Okay, so it's not just about individual countries taking action, it's about working together on a global scale.
Precisely. We need a coordinated global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, develop sustainable technologies, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change that are already happening.
This all sounds very complex. How do scientists even begin to study these massive interconnected systems like the AMOC and make predictions about what might happen in the future?
Well, it's a multidisciplinary effort, drawing on expertise from fields like physics, chemistry, biology, oceanography, meteorology, and computer science, just to name a few. And a key tool in their arsenal is climate modeling.
So these climate models are basically like giant simulations of the Earth's climate.
Essentially, yes. They're incredibly sophisticated computer programs that use mathematical equations to represent the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, land surface, ice sheets, and the interactions between them. They factor in things like greenhouse gas concentrations, solar radiation, volcanic eruptions, and even human activities.
Wow, so they're trying to capture the complexity of the entire Earth system in a computer program. That sounds incredibly challenging.
It is, and these models are constantly being refined and improved as our understanding of the climate system grows. But they're essential tools for understanding how the climate might change in the future and exploring different scenarios based on various factors.
But even with these sophisticated models, there's still a lot of uncertainty about how climate change will play out, right?
Absolutely. There is inherent uncertainty in any scientific endeavor, especially when dealing with a system as complex as the Earth's climate. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss the science or ignore the warnings these models are giving us.
It's like trying to predict the weather. We know there are limitations to our forecasts, but we still use them to make decisions.
Exactly. We make decisions based on the best available information, even when there's some level of uncertainty. And in the case of climate change, the potential consequences are so severe that even a small chance of occurrence warrants taking action.
So even though these models might not be perfect, they're still our best tools for understanding how the climate might change in the future. And they're telling us that we need to act now to prevent the worst-case scenarios.
That's right. And it's not just the models. We're seeing real-world evidence of climate change happening all around us. The melting glaciers, the rising sea levels, the more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, and floods. These are all signs that the climate is changing. And it's changing rapidly.
So it's not a matter of if climate change is happening, but how severe it will be and what we're going to do about it.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this open letter and the sense of urgency it conveys. We need to take these warnings seriously and act now to mitigate climate change and build a more sustainable future.
You know, one thing that strikes me about this open letter is that it's not just a dry scientific document. There's a real sense of passion and concern in the scientists' words. They're clearly deeply worried about the future of our planet.
You're absolutely right. There's a human element to this letter that's really compelling. It's not just data and projections. It's a plea from experts who are witnessing firsthand the changes happening to our planet.
And they're not just talking about abstract concepts. They're talking about real-world impacts on people's lives, their livelihoods, their cultures.
Exactly. They're highlighting the human cost of climate change, and that makes their message all the more powerful.
This conversation has been incredibly informative, but I have to admit it's also a bit sobering. The idea that a major ocean current system like the AMOC could collapse within our lifetimes is a daunting thought.
It is unsettling, but it's also a call to action. We can't afford to be paralyzed by fear or apathy. We need to channel that concern into constructive action.
So what can the average person do in the face of such a massive global challenge? It's easy to feel powerless, like our individual actions won't make a difference.
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that individual actions, when multiplied across millions of people, can have a significant impact. Think of it like voting. One vote might not seem like much, but when millions of people cast their ballots, it can change the course of history.
So you're saying that our individual actions, like making sustainable choices in our daily lives, can add up to create a larger movement for change?
Exactly. Every time you choose to walk or bike instead of driving, every time you opt for a plant-based meal, every time you buy energy-efficient appliances, you're making a difference. And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Talk to your friends and family about climate change. Share information on social media. Contact your elected officials. And advocate for policies that support a transition to a sustainable future.
So it's not just about changing our light bulbs, it's about changing the systems that got us into this mess in the first place.
Precisely. We need systemic change, and that requires collective action. Support businesses and organizations that are committed to sustainability, invest in renewable energy, and push for policies that prioritize a green economy.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom of climate change, but you've given me a sense of hope that we can actually turn things around.
I'm glad to hear that, because hope is essential. We need to believe that change is possible, and we need to act on that belief. Humanity has faced enormous challenges throughout history, and we've found ways to overcome them. This is no different. We have the ingenuity, the technology, and the resources to address climate change. What we need now is the political will and the collective determination to act.
And this open letter is a powerful call to action, not just for the Nordic Council of Ministers, but for all of us.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're all in this together, and the choices we make today, well, they will determine the future of our planet.
Well, that brings our deep dive to a close. It's been a whirlwind of information and, honestly, a bit of a reality check. But I think the key takeaway here is that we're not powerless in the face of this challenge. We all have a role to play in shaping a more sustainable future.
I couldn't agree more. Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference. And together, we can create the kind of future we want for ourselves and for generations to come.
So, to our listeners, we urge you to take what you've learned today and turn it into action. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. We're all in this together, and together we can make a difference.